Hi, I'm William.
And I'm Kat.
That means this is Info on the Go.
We're answering questions you want to know.
So, Kat, have you ever heard of the fence cutting wars before this episode?
I had never known there were fence cutting wars at all before you talked about it.
Okay. I once read this book about the beginning of the end of the Old West, which was a time period from the 19th to the 20th century. It really didn't go into detail, but it did talk a little bit about the fence cutting wars, and that kind of stuck with me over the years. And when we started doing this podcast, I was like, "Oh, the fence cutting wars. Let's do some research on it."
Oh, I gotcha. I gotcha. That sounds exciting. I like it when old books stick with you like that.
Yeah, so today on Info on the Go, the fence cutting wars. So we'll go back a little bit. Before the invention of barbed wire, the American West was the open range, with little fencing and large herds of cattle roaming freely. And this meant that farmers' crops were vulnerable to being trampled or eaten by cattle and wild buffalo or wild animals in general.
Yeah, right.
Uh, During this time period, wild buffalo or bison roamed in herds across the plains. So if you were a farmer and you had a field and you wound up with a herd of wild buffalo in it, I mean, there wasn't really much you could do from that.
Right.
So this open range grazing was done on public lands throughout the plains. Public lands were basically land that was owned by the state or territory.
Cattle owners would lead their herds to slaughterhouses near railheads on long cattle drives. The lack of fencing made it difficult to farm and ranch. The materials of the time to build fences were wood and stone, and these were expensive to use in open spaces of the plains.
So just to kind of talk about that for a second. So the plains lacking massive trees, right? So if you're clearing your field, you're going to stack what rocks you find, but there's not really a lot there, and that can become cumbersome to really
Right.
fence in the area that you're looking for, especially if you're just fencing in a pasture or something like that.
I can see that. I
Okay.
can see that.
So cattle drives were a crucial economic activity in the American West from the mid 19th to the 20th centuries. Over 27 million cattle were driven from Texas to railheads in Kansas for shipment to markets. Key trails, including the Shawnee, Goodnight, Chisholm.
Covering about 15 miles daily, with drives often taking up to 2 months. Herds averaged 3,000 cattle, managed by a team of cowboys, a cook, and a wrangler. The drives' logis- logistics included wagons, medical supplies, and strict schedules to avoid overexertion.
So you know that picture you got in your head on the wagon the covered wagon going along with the one guy sitting on it and all the cowboys riding along. That's pretty much what you're describing, right?
It's the Oregon Trail. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So the Chisholm Trail became particularly significant, connecting Texas to Kansas railheads and enabling large-scale shipments. Railhead towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita flourished as centers of cattle shipping. Other trails like the Goodnight Loving Trail expanded across to new markets in the West. And that Abilene just reminds me of that song, that old song that I cannot get out of my head. But anyway, I'm not going to sing it. I'm not going to sing here. So you go ahead.
Okay. I mean, you have lots of old songs that stick around in your head for days.
I'm telling you, and I'm not doing it on the podcast.
Cattle drives faced challenges such as disease. Yeah, better not get dysentery. Opposition from farmers over tick fever and conflicts with settlers. The Civil War disrupted eastern markets, leading to surplus cattle in Texas. However, after the war, rail expansion and rising beef demand revived the industry. By the late 19th century, railroads reached further south, reducing the need for long drives and ending the cattle drive era.
So we kind of went full face there talking about, cattle drives, but now we're going to get back into it. But first, we need to talk a little bit about some other stuff that's going on. So the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed people to claim 160 acres, and for our friends outside of the U.S., that's 65 hectares of land in the West. if they lived on it and improved it, and I believe Montana still has the Homestead Act enacted in their state. I'm not sure.
So you can just walk up there and claim 160 acres.
Well, you have to go to some government. I can't remember where you go, but you go but you have to live on it and you have to improve it. You can't just go and claim 160 acres and walk away from it.
Ah,
So, yeah, I'm pretty sure that Montana still does that. I'm not 100% sure though.
well, not a lot of people live in Montana.
No, they don't. Have you ever been to Montana?
No, but I want to go so bad. It looks so pretty in pictures.
Don't fly into Missoula
Oh, okay.
because you fly down a mountain and you fly up a mountain. Imagine that. Um, so farmers looking for cheap land to raise cattle moved west. Some of them built up large herds and companies started investing in big cattle. Those who owned the most cattle were called cattle kings, cattlemen, or cattle barons. So basically, I guess kind of really to explain what's going on here. If you were a cattleman or whatever, you would have like beef companies investing in your farming or your cattle operation, and so now you got big business backing the cattlemen. So now you got money behind it, right?
And job security because everybody wants meat and milk.
Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, I guess here we need to go to November 1874 when Joseph Glidden patented barbed wire. Glidden's barbed wire has two-stranded wire fence with sharp barbs. The barbed wire wasn't the first ever made. He got the idea after seeing Henry Rose's single-stranded barbed wire at the DeKalb County Fair.
Henry Rose's single strand barbed wire was a wooden fence with the sharp spikes that was patented in 1873. Rose's barbed wire was made of a wooden strip with a wire piece driven into it at a 90-degree angle. The wire pieces were about 2 inches long and were spaced about 8 inches apart. The wooden strips were tied to a wire fence. So I'm gonna try to give my best direct description of this. Imagine like a two before, and you drive barbs down into the two before, sticking up, kind of like like if you was to touch it or whatever, and then there would be a strand of wire that would connect that down the line. Does that make sense?
Okay. So it's just like posts and like some rope with this
Yeah, his
2x4 just
required.
hanging on it like a necklace.
Yes, his would require like these wooden strips with wire. Okay.
Okay.
That's Henry Rose's patent was these strips of wood that contained wire, and the wood had the barbs actually in them.
Gotcha. Okay. Rose's design was expensive and needed wood to be produced. Yeah, no, that does sound like a waste of resources
Yeah.
compared to Glidden's design, which was a big improvement. That same year, Jacob uh, Haish, an
H.
inventor and architect also from DeKalb, Illinois, who applied for a patent for his S-barbed wire design in 1874. He was granted the patent in 1875.
So the difference between the two was that Gildan's design used two strands of wire twisted together to hold multiple barbs in place. Hesh's design was similar to Gildan's, but used two wires strung together and a single barb. Okay, Gildan's design was inexpensive, easy to mass produce, and effective at containing livestock. Over the next 20 years, the two men would spend over $2 million in legal fees on who had the idea first. They both would make millions more in manufacturing, but eventually they would settle out of court. Each would pay the other the same amount per pound produced. However, Gildan's patent would be declared the winner in court. And so Gildan's design is what you think of barbed wire today. Like the two strands that are twisted and then the barbs kind of twisted into the wire, right?
Right.
Um, Hash's design was still two strands, but his barbs were not quite as close together as Gildan's. and it was a little it was still easier to produce, but it wasn't as good
as
as,
effective.
yeah, as Gildan's. Thank you. I was trying to think of the best way to say that.
Uh,
The
that
best
one.
thing I can tell you to do is Google images of Gildan's barbed wire design and Hesh's barbed wire design when you're not
Right,
driving.
right. Glidden's barbed wire in 1880 sold over 80 million pounds, making it the most popular barbed wire in the country. Farmers on the prairies and plains quickly realized that Glidden's wire was the cheapest, strongest, and longest lasting way to fence their yard.
So now 80 million pounds.
That's insane.
That is crazy. And you know, what did we say he invented this thing in like 1874? So 6 years later, he's done sold 80 million pounds. So now we're kind of leading up to how the fence cutting wars got here. Remember, we talked about how the plains were open grazing.
Right.
So we're about to get into what's going on now. So this simple invention had a huge impact on life in the Great Plains. Since the area had few trees, farmers had to buy expensive wooden rails from faraway forests to build fences. Barbed wire was way much cheaper and a much easier solution. Without it, most farmers couldn't have afforded to protect their land from cattle and sheep.
Hmm.
So
Now, up until this time, cattlemen had open range cattle, meaning the cattle would graze by roaming freely. Some cattlemen didn't own land. They would let their herds graze on public lands. Other cattlemen would rent or lease land for grazing. Either way, these cattlemen would still have cattle drives over long distances, as they would have to get the herd to the rail stations. This is where the herd could be sold.
So barbed wire basically ended the open range cattle industry. Within a few years, thousands of small farmers fenced off the open land where cattle had once grazed, roam freely. As a result, the old practice of driving cattle long distances to railheads in places like Dodge City or Abilene became impossible. Big cattlemen would fence off public lands for their cattle to graze. Now think, so um, they're fencing off public land. Some of these cattlemen were fencing off public land. Say, Cat, you didn't own any land and you depended on that public land, but now it's fenced off. What do? You know, you don't have another place to go for your cattle to graze.
Well, it was a different time back then.
Yeah, and they were putting these big big pockets were putting these fences in places they shouldn't have, and even some smaller people were fencing off stuff that they shouldn't have been fencing off. So the cattlemen that didn't own land are now shut off from the public land. So they didn't so now we're getting into what's going to cause the fence cutting wars.
Right. Here we should note the fence cutting wars didn't take place in one state or area. The fence cutting wars were widespread across the West, with notable conflicts in Texas, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, and Montana. The disputes began in Texas in 1881 and escalated during the 1880s. In Wyoming, an 1883 court ruling ordered the cattle company to remove illegal fences, but by 1885, barbed wire dominated eastern Wyoming, rendering legal resistance ineffective. Despite this, conflicts over fencing persisted in other regions into the late 1880s and early 1890s.
Wow. The fence cutting wars in Texas were particularly intense, fueled by a severe drought in 1883 that left landless cattlemen struggling to access water and grazing for their herds due to the widespread use of barbed wire fencing. Texans, believing in their right to shared public lands, resisted the enclosure of roads and access points. Fence cutting became widespread with reports of over half of Texas counties that year involving in well-known organized groups with armed protection.
Dang.
So, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you got to think, they're fencing off these public lands. Their cattle can't graze, and then this drought comes along, and now there's water's
No
being
water.
scarce, grass is hard to find.
Right.
Okay.
Right, right. So efforts to curb the violence included rewards, legal action, and intervention by the Texas Rangers, but the conflict persisted. Fence cutters, supported by local communities and even influential allies like the New York and Texas Land Company, faced off against ranchers who employed armed guards to defend their property. By late 1883, the damage caused by fence cutting exceeded 20 million statewide. Well, I mean that's the other reason that guy had, produced so much barbed wire.
Yeah. I mean, geez. I mean, that is a lot,
For sure. Tempers were flared.
to say the least. And some people lost their lives. I don't remember the exact count, but in almost every state that you mentioned, someone lost their lives due to this.
I believe
Uh,
it.
in 1883, groups of cowboys with names like the Owls, the Javelins, and the Blue Devils carried out widespread fence cutting, prompting ranchers to hire armed guards and the Texas Rangers to intervene. By the fall, the damage caused by these actions, like Kat said, exceeded over 20 million. In January of 1884, Governor John Ireland convened a special legislative session, resulting in laws that imposed prison sentence for fence cutting, required property owners to remove illegal fences, and mandated gates every 3 miles on fenced lands. These measures effectively ended large-scale fence cutting in Texas by the mid 1880s.
Mm. In San Miguel County, New Mexico, the fence cutting wars were driven by tensions between Mexicanos and Anglo settlers, particularly large land companies and cattlemen claiming public lands in the 1880s. The conflict centered on disputes over land ownership as Anglo buyers like Philip Millhiser claimed both purchased fields and communal lands from the earlier Las Vegas land grant. Local Mexicanos argued that communal lands could not be privatized without community consent.
So basically, they fenced it off and then claimed it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So while the case of, what did you say that was? Milner's?
Millhiser
Millhiser?
versus Padilla.
Okay. Um, that was in 1887 to 1889, was under review. Anglo landowners involved enclosed thousands of acres with fences, effectively seizing common lands. Violence ensued, including fence cutting, shootings, and arson, as small Mexicano farmers resisted these encroachments. So, yeah, I mean, tensions are rising there. Really, basically, they went in and took state land and then turned around and claimed it just by fencing it in.
Right. On May 3rd, 1889, 21 fence cutters were indicted on 26 counts in New Mexico, with strong opposition from local officials advocating severe penalties. Judge Long, a businessman favoring regional economic growth, pushed for strict verdicts. However, vigilant supporters surrounded the courthouse, leading to a not guilty verdict for one man and the dismissal of charges against the others. The Las Vegas Daily Optic highlighted public resentment toward large land enclosures perceived as restricting access to public lands. While fence cutting continued as legal systems failed to address land disputes, these efforts ultimately failed to halt the fencing of public lands as organized violence gave way to political stagnation.
The fence cutting wars of the late 19th century had a profound impact on the American West, shaping its legal, economic, and social landscape. Economically, the widespread adoption of barbed wire solidified the transition from open range ranching to enclosed private holdings, transforming cattle ranching practices. This marked the end of the open range as fencing privatized lands and restricted cattle drives, forcing smaller ranchers and inherent herders to adopt or leave the industry. Wealthy ranchers and landowners gained dominance by fencing vast tracts of land, marginalizing small scale ranchers and farmers. So remember those deep pockets we talked about,
Right,
investing into these cattle farms? That's where that played out.
right, right. Legally and politically, states like Texas passed laws criminalizing fence cutting and regulating the use of barbed wire. In 1884, Texas legislation mandated prison sentences for fence cutting and required property owners to provide gates for public passage. These conflicts also underscored the need for clearer regulations regarding the use and ownership of public lands, especially in regions like New Mexico where disputes over communal lands intensified.
Socially, the wars um, exacerbated tensions among landowners, small ranchers, homesteaders, and ethnic groups. In New Mexico, clashes between Mexicanos and Anglo landowners over the fencing of communal lands reflected broader struggles over land and culture rights. The wars were marked by violent confrontations, including shootings, property destruction, and the formation of vigilante groups, eroding trust in legal systems and highlighting the limits of law enforcement in the frontier regions.
Dang.
Yeah.
The fencing movement also ended communal land use traditions, particularly in Texas and New Mexico, as wealthy landowners consolidated land for private use, displacing smaller ranchers and communal farmers. Additionally, the restriction of access to open grazing lands and the blocking of traditional cattle trails made long distance cattle drives less viable. This, coupled with the expansion of railroads, hastened the decline of cattle drives and reshaped the cattle industry.
I would love to be able to go on a long cattle drive. I think that would be fun. I don't want to go for months or anything. I'd like to do it. Have you ever seen the movie City Slickers?
No.
Okay. It's an old movie. Now I'm showing my age, but there was this, I guess, getaway where these guys from the city could go on a cattle drive
Hmm.
for like a week. I would love to do that. I need to look into that. I think that would be fun.
Yeah, my only experience with cattle drives is Home on the Range, which is an animated movie.
I've never driven cattle with a horse, but I used to own some horses, and yeah, they were fun, and I would love to do that.
Well, I mean, it does sound like fun. I do like camping.
Yeah, I think it would be fun. You need to look up the movie City Slickers. I'm pretty sure it holds up. They don't have cell phones in it, but it was pretty fun.
Okay, but Home on the Range is a good cartoon.
All right, I'll check it out. I'll
Okay,
watch yours, you watch mine. How about that?
fair enough.
All right. So the fence cutting wars ultimately symbolized the transformation of the West from a largely open and communal frontier to a region defined by private property, industrial agriculture, and more settled society. However, they left lasting scars, including social inequalities and cultural dislocation, particularly for smaller ranchers, indigenous groups, and Mexicanos.
The other big grazing conflict that happened around this same time period but lasted much longer were the sheep wars.
Okay. So the sheep wars were a series of violent conflicts in the late 19th and early 20th century in the American West, primarily between cattle ranchers and sheep herders. These disputes arose from competition for overgrazing rights on public land and open lands, as both groups sought access to the same resources for their livestock. The wars were essentially intense in regions like Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, where open grazing lands were vital to livelihood of the ranchers and herders.
Hmm.
Hey, I had never heard of the sheep wars till I got into the fence cutting wars, and I was like, "What?" And then when that's why I included it, by the way.
Well, that's fair. I mean, we're talking about two different wars here today.
Yes, but it kind of leads into the same thing.
Right, it is all along the same lines.
Okay.
The Sheep Wars were a series of violent conflicts in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries in the American West, primarily between cattle ranchers and sheep herders. These disputes rose from competition over graze. Did you just read that? I feel like you did. No.
Um, or intense regions like Wyoming, Colorado. Maybe I did. Okay, so cattle ranchers believe that sheep overgraze lands. I guess that's where you can start out. Do you see where I'm at?
Oh, yes. Okay. Cattle ranchers believed that sheep overgrazed land, leaving little for their cattle, fueling tensions, especially during times of drought or economic hardship. Additionally, as sheep herding became more profitable, it posed a threat to the dominance of cattle ranching in the region. Ethnic and cultural divisions also contributed to the conflict, as many sheep herders were of
That's cute.
Basque, I would say
That's
Basque,
oh, okay.
unless it's Basque, but I'm pretty sure it's Basque.
Maybe. Okay, go with Basque.
Mexican or Native American descent. While cattle ranchers were often Anglo settlers, these divisions deepened mistrust and hostility with cattle ranchers, arguing that sheep destroyed vegetation by eating grass down to the roots and trampling grazing lands.
Have you ever seen where sheep graze? They do. They pretty much eat it down to the roots.
Oof.
I
No
mean,
more grass for you.
yeah. Just get a sheep or a goat for that fact.
Right.
The conflicts were marked by extreme violence, including the mass slaughter of sheep.
Oh,
Ranchers would often target sheep directly, killing entire flocks or driving them off cliffs. So, not quite like the fence cutting wars there. They got pretty violent with their livestock.
jeez.
Yeah, I mean, there were also attacks on sheep herders and their dogs with threatening notices like and warnings issued to intimidate, property destruction was common as cattle ranchers would burn sheep camps and destroy equipment. Notable incidents of violence, including the, uh, I guess that what would you say, Rut County sheep
Oh,
massacre in Colorado in 1905, where over 1,500 sheep were killed, and the Spring Creek raid in Wyoming in 1909, where cattle ranchers attacked a sheep count, killing several herders.
jeez.
I'm telling you, they were getting pretty rough there.
Leave the sheep alone. As tensions escalated, governments gradually intervened, introducing regulations on grazing rights. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 was a significant step in controlling and licensing the use of public grazing lands. Over time, the expansion of railroads and diversification of the economy reduced the dependence on open grazing, easing tensions. The transition to enclosed ranching and regulated land also helped reduce conflict, marking the end of the open range era. The sheep wars highlighted the intense competition for resources in the American West, reflecting broader social, economic, and cultural tensions of the time. While the violence eventually subsided, the conflicts left lasting scars on the communities involved and helped shape modern land use policies in the region.
So now you know why I included both of them because they both had to do with open range grazing.
Right.
They both happened around about the same time, and they both involved the fact of, herds, or I guess cattlemen or these cattle barons um, claiming these public lands, and then the dispute over grazing rights. And then you had the fence, you had the fence going up around about this time. So you have a lot going on that is impacting laws that will ultimately shape the region.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, and you're so used to doing things one way, and then people come in and, nah, sorry, I'm
Yeah.
putting my fence here.
And the Homestead Act really fueled a lot of it, and barbed wire fueled a lot of it, and then droughts fueled a lot of it. Public grazing lands fueled a lot of it. And during this time, you had, and I'm not blaming it all on the cattlemen, so save your emails and stuff, but you had those big companies with deep pockets that would do anything to secure their money, right?
Right.
Or their investment, I guess I should say.
Right. Well, William and I want to thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you.
Join the Facebook group at Info on the Go
Share your ideas with us.
or ask us a question.
Subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcast.
Send us a text using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
Till next time.
Stay curious.